Welcome to the Bicurian podcast, where we explore and embrace the seeming contradictions of life. What actually is Bicurian, you ask?
Well, you may not necessarily have a mental concept of Bicurian, partially maybe because it's a made-up word. You embody it. What's happening right now in terms of the divisions between us is a focus on that which is different.
And lack of understanding and empathy for people's beliefs is no longer an excuse.
And it is in the differences we carry in ourselves that we find the Bicurian moment.
When you really dig into something, you're going to see some depth to it. It's not just a race thing. It's not just a conservation thing.
It's letting go of the or to make room for the and. We embrace all of you. Welcome to the Bicurian.
Hi, I'm Aisla.
And I'm Eric.
And welcome to the Bicurian podcast. This week's show is roughly on the gig economy with some potential meandering into labor standards and...
Yeah. So this came up because a few weeks ago, both Lyft and Uber went public with an IPO. That means they're now publicly traded companies. Since that happened, Uber has posted some massive losses. And there's some question about whether or not they can actually become profitable. I mean, when you lose $1 billion, that's quite a bit to make up to be profitable.
I've never even lost $1 billion.
Ever.
So I don't know.
Me either. So that just got us thinking because there's been a lot of articles around. I did see one just highlighting a driver for Lyft that had been doing it full time for a long time and how they basically got nothing for their years of loyal service to a company that went public, and lined all of the people who work for Lyft directly, lined their pockets with money in that, and they're now poised to have public investing to make them profitable and to grow the company. But it really struck me that the entire industry that Lyft and Uber have created relies on freelance drivers that are essentially treated like contract employees.
Right. And so one of the things that I did, as is my usual instinct, is I kind of looked into first, like, what is essentially this whole gig economy that is getting all this press nowadays. And I like one of the sites I found called Tech Target, pretty interesting site. They defined it as a free market system in which temporary positions are common and organizations contract with independent workers for short-term engagements. So obviously the word was first used in an industry that you're familiar with, which is the music industry. Like, typically people don't hire musicians for their club. They do short-term engagements with contracted and workers, right? So that's kind of the underlying model, right? And so there's a lot of speculation that this whole gig economy. The other thing I've heard it called is the hustle. That's the term that the kids are using these days. But there's a lot of speculation and predictions that it's going to become a much larger segment of the workforce and the economy. Some predictions are 40% by next year.
Wow.
Of American workers, 2020, will be participating in the gig economy. And so that, for me, was part of the investigation process, was kind of like, well, what is happening? Why is this happening? And some of it is the mobility.
Yeah.
Like, people like the ability to earn a little extra cash, or they like the ability to work on their own terms, on whatever hours they want. And the smartphones and the internet allow for a lot more pairing of people and the workers and businesses in that, like, really immediate way. Whereas, like, when I was in my 20s, I actually worked for a staffing agency. It was a great summer job for me. I didn't have to get a regular job, and I had work all summer. But there was no way I had, like, a job today.
Right.
These were like 3 and 4 week contracts and stuff like that. So it's interesting because it's something we've had before, but because of the internet, because of our smartphones and the apps and the sort of immediacy of communication, there's a flexibility around it. A lot more people can participate if they
Yeah.
want to.
Yeah, technology has made it, I feel, and we found a site that had some listed um, applications that meet this criteria, right? So gig or ways of making money. Essentially, anybody with some technology background and the ability to code and the ability to figure out a service where somebody would be willing to pay somebody for something, they've done it.
Right. And
like we found renting out your wardrobe.
right, if you have designer clothes, this one I actually found to be quite disturbing. I don't actually know why. It's really probably just fine. And it's list your designer clothes and then other people can choose to rent them from you. And so you'll make money off your designer clothes.
Right.
I don't know. The idea of like putting the things that I wear up on an app. I mean, when I don't have any designer clothes, so I'm totally safe from ever participating in this particular app. But
Yeah. But there's things like handyman services.
Mhm.
There's things like moving services.
Personal assistant, if you need people to schedule appointments for you or type up notes.
Of course, a big one that many of our listeners may have heard of is things like Fiverr, which allow you to basically find all kinds of services in creative realms or even just automation of tasks. If you have a large number of data fields to input into something, you can Fiverr hires that out to have somebody do that repetitive task. So, in some ways, I feel like that's really positive. There's opportunities for people to make money doing something that somebody else is willing to pay for. But then we get into the Uber and the Lyft. And um, go ahead. I haven't read the article yet, so I was going to let you inform me because you found an interesting one.
I did. So California is the title of the article is they're cracking down on the gig economy. And it looks like more what they're actually trying to do is address some of these loopholes that exist for companies like Uber. So for example, so one of the things that they talk about in the article is that very recently California passed a bill called AB 5, or is passing a bill. They're in the midst of it. And it builds on a California State Supreme Court ruling that made a much more specific and clear test for whether or not someone is an employee or an independent contractor. So the federal definition of an independent contractor or an employee is a little vague. I did look it up, and even after reading it, I have some questions. So I can understand why states might try to make it more specific. And so they said to hire an independent contractor, businesses must prove that the worker is A, free from the company's control, B, doing work that is not central to the company's business, and C, has an independent business in that industry.
So I can definitely see how all of the drivers that are contract for Uber and Lyft are not critical to the function of those companies. They would
Right.
certainly be able to exist and function if all of their contract employees suddenly didn't show up one day.
Right. That's a and so
I'm
it's
being
interesting. Yeah, right,
sarcastic.
exactly. I got that. And the interesting thing is, when they talk about this in the article, they said, it's not just, Uber and Lyft drivers that might be um impacted by this bill. It could be Amazon drivers, it could be manicurists, it could be exotic dancers, it could be lawyers. Except later on, they go to talk about that in the bill, they did put many different industries. They did exclude a list of professionals, including accountants, insurance agents, hairstylists who rent booths at salons, real estate agents, doctors, because there are a lot of these professions kind of do that same thing where they have independent contractors who, work at like a doctor works at a hospital, but he's still a doc. Like, he's still got his private practice or her private practice, like, or a
Yeah.
surgeon will go in, they use the hospital services and they can be found through the hospital, but they aren't necessarily employed by the hospital.
Well, I made the comment at the beginning of the show about the idea of freelance drivers. You listed off those jobs: hairdresser, massage therapist, many of those sorts of things that you would actually consider to be freelance, right? And they have worked in our economy by forming basically little coalitions or joining a group. Things like Remax comes to mind, where it's essentially you're hired by them, but you're still sort of freelance. You can take advantage of what they have. You pay them a commission for the services they provide you, but you're still an independent contractor.
Well, and also, and there's more professionals. I didn't list them all, but in looking at everything that I can see here, the professionals that they are not, or the professionals that they have listed, are all professionals that tend to make a good wage, whereas the Uber and Lyft drivers, they make okay money, but they don't make great money. And so it's a really different thing when you've got a lawyer who's making, $100,000 a year, who is part of a law firm as an independent contractor,
Yeah.
versus a Lyft driver who's making substance wages and isn't getting any benefits for their employment. They don't get, their taxes aren't paid by Lyft, so they have to pay the full 30%.
Yep.
Rather than the 7.5 that you pay when your employer covers all of it. They don't necessarily get a subsidy for insurance. Like, there's all these other benefits that someone who's making, $18 to $25 an hour isn't necessarily going to be in a place to cover. Whereas that lawyer or that doctor, where, of course, maybe I'm making the stereotype that they're making good money, but they're probably making better money than that.
Yeah.
And so I think that that's a part of it, is that they're trying to address what they call it income inequality, that they're saying that there are professionals that, in a certain way, because you can argue, right? Like, they have to exclude lawyers, because a law firm that has 10 independent contracting lawyers, their lawyers are absolutely central to their business.
Yes.
Like, there's no way you can argue that's not happening. And so they had to actually exclude them, and they made this decision, and they made it based on income equity. They said there are some professionals that this is how they do business, and they make plenty of good money. They can cover their expenses. They're not being put into like a working poor situation.
Well, and I think you have to look at it in a slightly different way too, because a lawyer could leave a law firm, start their own practice,
Mhm.
join another law firm. There's a lot of options that they would have.
Right.
So
Whereas the Uber or Lyft driver doesn't really have that same option.
exactly. So, they can't become a freelance driver and write their own app and set that all up and function without this. So it actually kind of goes both ways. The drivers are integral to the Lyft and Uber business model, but likewise, the reason that they can even be a freelance driver is based on that technology and that business model that has been set up. So I think one of the key things there is that most of those jobs you mentioned, you don't have to work for a firm. You could start your own practice as a doctor, as a lawyer, as a massage therapist. I could go on.
Right. No, I think that's a really good point, that they're dependent on Lyft and Uber and the technology, and they're also being very controlled by it, which is
Yes.
essentially an employee.
For example, there's been numerous stories about Lyft and Uber changing the pay structures and stuff, and suddenly people are just getting paid less, or setting up interesting ways of compensating them with essentially a bonus for working certain hours that imply a certain amount of control. Let's call it what it is, right? I mean, you're motivated to go and make that money, but they're not being generous with it unless you're doing exactly what they want, because they want drivers to drive during the peak time. So they might bonus you out for that.
Yeah. And so this article was talking about part of Uber's profit model, like many in the gig economy, is dependent on the money they save from skirting U.S. labor laws,
Yeah.
which is part of that's not the whole story, but part of the conflict between the taxi drivers in New York and the Uber process there. And misclassification, classifying employees as contractors happens a lot. It's a pretty common occurrence. This is a more egregious form of it in that the whole business model is based on that. And one of the things that they talk about is independent contractors or self-employed contractors don't have a legal right to form labor unions or negotiate contracts. So what you're talking about where they don't get together and say, we feel like this pay structure is kind of unfair. They each individual driver could certainly say that, but if they were actually to form some sort of coalition to address that, that's actually illegal for them to do.
Interesting.
Like,
So
or
they don't even have the option.
they don't have the legal right to
Yeah.
do it, as opposed to employees have the right. And then, of course, Uber doesn't have to pay taxes, benefits, overtime, or minimum wages. So if you decide you're going to drive for 5 hours and you only make $15 in those 5 hours, that's too bad, so sad.
And I feel like why this kind of resonated with us and became something we wanted to talk about is because both of us use Lyft and Uber. It's so convenient. It's fantastic. I don't ever notice the drivers that have picked me up complaining about it. They're always happy. They're happy to be doing what they're doing. Other than, I've pried a little bit into, how do you feel about how you're being paid and that sort of thing. And I mean, nobody's ever going to tell you, well, I make too much money. So you got to take that into account. But in general, yeah, they don't feel like they're necessarily valued by this entity that is paying them for what they're doing with me in the car right now.
Right. Well, and I usually ask because most of them will have like both stickers, Uber and Lyft, and I'll ask them like, who do you like? Who do you like driving for better?
Yeah, it's been Lyft in my experience.
100% of the time, they tell me they like Lyft's app. They get paid better. They get treated better, which doesn't mean they get treated well or paid well.
Again, we're talking about
and
compared to.
They have that. The other thing that they talk about is that the gig economy as it is, like with some of these like exploitation pieces, costs the state a lot of money. They're not paying those taxes. And so that means that state services are obviously not necessarily going to get funded. And perhaps some of these people are going to need them more if they're living on a subsistence. I mean, that's one of my issues with Walmart, right? Like they didn't pay they didn't pay their employees enough. So even though people were working, they were still needing to use public services.
Yeah.
So if this California case or if this California bill gets passed, then they have another case coming where there's a case that's suing the Dynamex drivers, then it would represent a major shift in how California deals with this. And part of why we care about that is there are a lot of companies, national companies based in California. And so the expectation is often that when California goes in a direction, it kind of ripples across the country.
Yeah.
And especially like Colorado, where we are, it was super connected to California. And in terms of like just a lot of folks that migrate here or businesses, like your office is a satellite office of a California based, at least here in the US company. And so just being aware that this change really could have an impact on how this is viewed across the country will certainly bring up questions of what is the way to do this.
Well, we've spoken about this many times on our show, that technology is leading us down paths that we just never imagined. And so to say that because something that 20 years ago nobody would have ever thought, there'd be an app and you push a button, it shows up at your door, you get in their car, they take you where you want to go, you push the tip button and it bills your credit card. Like, that's disruptive technology. And we need to be able to adapt to disruptive technology. We can't just say, oh, well, there's all these loopholes and that should be okay because we just never thought of it before.
Yeah. And what it brings up for me is I wonder if we need to come up with another classification that's somewhere between employee and independent contractor. And maybe that's not a good idea. It just seems like, if 40% of the American workforce is expected to move into this new sort of thing, and there's a lot, like they talk about it, there's a shifting culture around work life balance and business and business environment. Like a lot of people want the flexibility to be home. They want to, the freelance apps, and the reason that people are going for independent contracting who have, these super legitimate jobs like, graphic design or even lawyer, is because they want to take limited contracts so they can have either more time for their art or their hobby or their family or something like that. And so recognizing that, the American people have started to say, killing ourselves so that we can work 60, 80 hours a week, not spend time with our families and not pursue our passion, never be outside, whatever it is. There are a lot of people are saying no to that. And this is a way that they are trying to shift some power into their own hands. Some places it's obviously being exploited. But they talked about the sharing economy, the gift economy, and the barter economy. And that was one of the things that happened around the recession was a lot of like small communities started a barter economy where you could trade services rather than money. So you could live a little bit off the capitalist grid. And to me, there's some interesting discoveries there for us as a culture in this whole process. And then I just wonder, like, what if we acknowledge that this disruptive technology has created a new opportunity for people?
Yeah, that is definitely the other side of the coin. I think the reason why Uber and Lyft don't have a massive shortage, I was going to say shortage of drivers. They do. Actually, they need more in general, especially during a lot of peak times and times when people don't want to work. But in general, I can go on my app here in Denver, click a button, have a car here in 3 minutes at any time of day. So that's showing me that there are people who have decided that the benefits of the freedom do outweigh some of the negatives. But I just question yet another entire industry that's sort of based on a kind of a shadier practice. So yeah, I'm not saying we need to punish people who want that job or think that that's a good thing to be doing for them by making it go away. But I don't think that a company should be making tons of money. And again, they're not. They're losing $1 billion a quarter right now. But their model is to make money by essentially paying people nothing, a portion of, what they would get just for, driving somebody around or whatever. It doesn't seem entirely fair. So there needs to be some sort of a balance done with it.
Well, and what you're saying is, and one of the things we're looking at these apps that were listed with the different things, and most of them were a lot more freedom in terms of they listed, people could submit jobs that they had, or,
Yeah.
One of them was care.com or something like that. Yeah. And it was all sorts of care, pet care, adult care, child care. So you could get on and you could put in your credentials as a caretaker or care provider, and then people could, apply to have you come and take care of their pet or their
And in that
ailing
case,
parent or whatever. And that's matching things, right?
yeah, in
Like,
that case, that's better than going down to the local coffee shop or whatever and posting up your business card on the board and
yeah.
hoping somebody sees it and wants you to watch their kid or whatever. I think it also opens up a great opportunity for there to be a little bit of a vetting process so that if you're accessing the app, that the people that might be taking care of your child or your pet or an adult in your life are vetted in some way, and you can count on a little bit of trust to come from that.
Right. There can be more, the more that, and wanted to and never did use rover.com. It's a dog walking and dog sitting service that I thought looked really great. And it did have a vetting process. Like the people who applied had to go through sort of
Yeah.
a referencing situation. And then if you wanted to have someone watch your pet, you had the ability to ask them questions and see like references from other people they'd done stuff for. So I really liked that, as opposed to like my friend Sally's friend is free and can help out with your dog next week. Like I don't know what's going to happen there.
A friend of mine and my wife had a dog walking business 10 years ago, probably a little longer than that even, that was before all of this gig economy had taken off. And, the person, my friend that primarily did the dog walking would usually get business while she was out walking dogs, talking to other people walking dogs, mentioning what they did, doing it in specific neighborhoods that, were more affluent. So you knew they had some disposable income to maybe spend some money on a pet sitter or a dog walker.
Right.
And I mean, I think about it now and yeah, I mean, it feels like the boat was missed because they could be running that right now through an app had they had that knowledge and capability. So I think it's a great idea to make some of this available. But in most of those cases, there's not the overhead. Car maintenance is no joke. Even with our modern cars that seem like they run better than, every decade cars seem to just get better. But realistically, there's car maintenance, there's gas, there's insurance. There's a whole lot of things that you have to carry just to show up to work for Lyft or Uber.
Right. Well, and I think your point is valid that if I work for a dog walking service, I could always go gather my own dog walking clients. Or
Right. If you went through the app enough times and you built up a client database or whatever, you could pull yourself off of that and just go
Right.
direct with them. There's
So
you're not limited in any way to do that.
So the control that Uber and Lyft have over their drive, and because it was one of the things it was saying, like you have a certain amount of control of your employees. It's not just where they are or it's literally their ability to get the jobs. Like, because the reality is that nobody is going to go hop into a car where someone just has a sign on it that says, "I'll drive you places." Like,
I was just going to say, I'm going to try that. I'm just going to stick a sticker up and said, "I'll drive you."
you wouldn't
Inquire within.
Don't pick anybody up. Seriously, that's called, what is it? Hitchhiking. And
and
that's
that becomes this interesting thing, right? Because now what you're doing might not be entirely legal. There are places where taxis cannot stop and pick you up by law.
Huh.
LA had that law, and they finally decided to allow taxis to stop on the street unsolicited to like offer people. You can hail a taxi in Los Angeles. It was not available until a few years ago now. But like there's laws about that. And Uber and Lyft just overrode that, right? Because now all of a sudden you just had a different way because you're hailing from a different point of view. But that person's like a mile away. All you're really doing is using an app to put your hand up and whistle to get a car. So, and they have been shut down in several places like London and stuff.
And Austin won't let either of them in there. They have a local setup that has
So
some
again,
difference
they've
in
made it a community thing.
Yeah. So there isn't really like a strong sort of end result here. More just noticing that this is an innovation that has a lot of possibilities for our economic development, and as well as some of the personal freedoms that people want in terms of work-life balance. And then it has some drawbacks that have to do with labor standards and what your business model looks like. And so it's just something worth, I think.
Is it
looking
actual
at.
exploitation? That's the real question for me. And I think there's certain areas where it is. But again, like if I were to hire a dog walker, if I had a dog through an app, that wouldn't feel like as much of an exploitive act as using Lyft. And again, I do. And that's why this one kind of hit me when we were talking about different topics and stuff, because I'm guilty of using the service that I also think is not entirely fair. So it's something to think about in our day-to-day life as we're going about and using these new disruptive technologies.
Yeah.
nothing comes for free. We pay for it, right? But, you know, I do think, it is our civic responsibility to pay attention to those sorts of things to see and make sure that maybe we find a way to make this work for everybody.
Agreed.
Welcome to the Bicurian moment. So, I felt like a bit of positive news would be fun for my Bicurian moment.
Oh, then maybe I should go first because mine's not positive.
Oh, all right, you go
Or
first.
should we end on a high note?
We'll end on a high note.
Okay, I'll be quick because I just disillusioned myself. I had sort of rose-colored glasses about, and don't ask me why, European sports. And this article a few days ago came across my feed. It was called, the title of it was How Football Leaks is Exposing Corruption in European Soccer. Football Leaks is like a clever name for, it's like WikiLeaks. But this gentleman or football player, soccer player, I guess is probably a better way to say it in this podcast, released a lot of information on a bunch of controversial practices around European soccer, which apparently is a huge moneymaker and makes more in one season, or did last year, than our hockey, baseball, and football league combined.
Yep. And that's our bubble. We don't always know what's going on in the rest of the world. I can tell you that the most popular sport in the world is football, soccer. It's played everywhere, and it is covered by the jurisdiction of things like FIFA and some other entities, but they are constantly embroiled in things. And it goes to show you that just about anywhere where somebody stands to make money, you can watch and probably see some corruption.
Yeah. And
Even something fun.
I love soccer, football. I played it. I really loved when I got to see it when I was living there. And so I definitely had this, I don't know, idealized version of how that all works. At any rate, it was a really interesting article. And it just, for me, the Bicurian moment was sort of realizing that I know I'm in a bubble in different ways, and that there's always a new way to discover that I don't have any awareness of something. And it was also interesting. Like, this kid was pretty brave in terms of releasing a lot of documents. He's in prison for it. I mean, maybe he'll get out because he's exposing illegal practices and corruption. Maybe he won't get out because the people he exposed are very, very powerful. So,
well, and there's always that question of, if you do something illegal and it's for the greater good, you still did something illegal. So, he might be in trouble for that.
I learned that from Harry Potter.
Yeah.
I mean, well,
and I'm into a sport that equally has suffered from tons and tons of corruption, to the point where it's hard to really even root for anybody. And the season's starting up right now, but I'm a cyclist and I like cycling, and I follow cycling. And
I thought you were going to meant musician, but
no,
that's not a sport.
I'm actually talking about
No.
sport.
I'm kidding.
And in cycling, obviously everybody knows about the Lance Armstrong thing. And what's funny about that is you don't have to dig very deep to realize that they've shut down so many people. They made an example out of him, but he was literally doing the same thing that everyone else was doing. And he said that, and he outed a bunch of people because he didn't want to go down by himself. And that's just where that sport had gotten to. It was corrupt. And they were celebrating it because when Lance Armstrong was winning, people were watching cycling on TV. That's unheard of. But there was a reason to do it. There was a superstar in the sport. And then it turned out he was cheating very, very often. And nowadays, I mean, he set numbers on, parts of the Tour de France, which is, of course, a multi-week ride, that won't be touched because they're so heavily regulating things now that, nobody can do the numbers that he did. But it has slowed down interest. So there's this fine line just in how a lot of these entities operate. And it makes it hard to be a fan sometimes.
Yeah, it really does. So, and at any rate, so that's why I was thinking maybe we should end on yours because mine's a little bit of a downer.
So, mine was actually going to be on a little bit more of the positive. We're caught up in a lot of negative news and stuff. There's been some really interesting science news this year. Um, Specifically two things involving space. And we take for granted that nowadays space travel is something that's trying to be monetized. That sense of exploration that led to the initial moon landing seems dead, but it's not really. Just that the things happening aren't always as dramatic, but like the photo that we actually got of a black hole,
That was so cool.
I think it's amazing. And we had spent years and years and years, and physicists and quantum physicists basically being able to tell us exactly what we would see, but we hadn't seen it. And then we did see it. And so sometimes it's nice to have scientific theory just confirmed. And then another thing that I read was about transient lunar phenomenon, TLPs, if you haven't heard of them. Essentially, if you set up a telescope and look at the moon for long enough, you're going to see flashes of light. And it's been documented for 1,000 years. Nobody knows what they are. Sometimes they light up bright for an hour. Sometimes it's 1 or 2 seconds. But some scientists are actually coming up with a theory to explain it, and it could be lunar quakes essentially. So it's just fun to see, amidst a scroll through the news, that it's not all what's happening in a bubble, politics, economy. There is innovation that's happening and scientific exploration. And for some reason, that just makes me feel good.
Yeah, no, I think it's great. I think it's also a reminder there's more to discover. And there's
Absolutely.
something kind of hopeful in that there's more to discover.
I think so. I have a scientific brain, and I took a lot of science in college and all of that. And it's definitely where my heart lies as far as that stuff goes. And yeah, it is. It's exciting. It gets your imagination going in a way that, it's easy to forget about sometimes.
Well, uh, thanks for listening. Join our mailing list at bit.ly/bicure, BICUR, and get episodes and blogs conveniently emailed directly to you. Learn more about us at bicurian.com/podcast.
And if you like what we're doing, please tell your friends about us and share the episodes you find most interesting on your platform of choice.
Thank you and have a great week.